thought it might be interesting today to take a little stroll, we can call it that, a journey through Holy Week and look at it day by day, day 1, day 2, day 3, based on what we know from sacred scripture, obviously, but also some of the ways in which our sacred tradition informs us. And also kind of wanting to lay a little bit of a parallel on this over what is going on really on the Jewish calendar during this week. I think it's important that we remember this week that Jesus is the fulfillment of all Jewish prophecy. He is the ultimate fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. And so there are events that happen during Holy Week that sometimes I think as Christians get lost to us because they're not part of our tradition. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I think it gives us a richer understanding of the events of that week and a richer understanding of certainly what the apostles' experience would have been with him and the people in the city of Jerusalem, what their experience would have been. So I thought that would be fun to do, and you know me, I thought this would also be an opportunity to show some of my favorite artworks. So we're going to do that as well. I'm a big believer that sacred art really draws us into the divine, and I guess if you don't know that about me after 6 years, you're never going to know that about me, but that is true. So that's always fun for me. And then there is something I want to share with you at the very end of this presentation that some of you know that I was in Rome 2 weeks ago for a series of meetings. One of those meetings regarded a collection, an artwork collection that some of you know I have curated since February of 2019. I've been trying to catalog many of those items over the last several years, many of which had no historical provenance to them. We didn't know where they came from. We didn't know who the artist was. And that has been an ongoing process. And I've got about 120 of them fully cataloged now, 200 partially cataloged. But I had a meeting at the University of Rome, or with a professor from the University of Rome, and he had consulted with someone from the Ethiopian College of the Vatican about a very specific artifact that's in this collection. And I'm so excited to share this with you. You're the first people that are going to hear this morning, okay? So I'm going to save that for the end, and you'll see how it relates to the week we're going to talk about, okay? So the exact order of the events during Holy Week is kind of debated by biblical scholars because there's sort of nuances, shades of differences between the gospel accounts about what specifically happened on what particular day. So there's some debate about that, but the timeline, I think the consistency of the timeline is something that everybody agrees upon, and certainly the major events of that week, the most holy days of this Holy Week, no one disagrees or disputes what those days were and what happened on those days. So I want you to kind of follow along with me, if you will, in the footsteps of Jesus from Palm Sunday, where we are today, and we're going to go as far as next Sunday, which will be Easter Sunday, sort of exploring some of the major events along the week. So today, of course, we are at day 1, Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem of today, day 1. This is day 1. So the Sunday before our Easter Sunday, we all know that Jesus begins his journey, his entry into Jerusalem, knowing that he is going for a very specific purpose. He's going to die. He's going to lay down his life. Nearing the village of Bethphage, he set 2 of his disciples, this was in our reading this morning, he set 2 of his disciples ahead to tell them to look for a donkey. And it's a donkey, the colt of a donkey, the foal of a donkey. The disciples were instructed to untie the animal and bring it to him. And then, as we know, as the story goes, Jesus sat on the donkey and slowly, humbly, I mean, have you ever thought about this? It's a donkey. Slowly and humbly makes his entry into Jerusalem. But this fulfills an ancient prophecy. This fulfills something from Zechariah, which says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So the crowds welcomed him how? Like we welcomed him this morning. The crowds welcomed him by waving palm branches in the air and shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. I'm always personally struck by the contrast of Sunday coming into the Hosannas and how very quickly that comes unraveled. How very quickly the crowd turns against him. Hosanna's on Sunday, and by Friday it is crucify him. And we're talking about only a matter of a few days, really. So, this is what I think is interesting about Palm Sunday. I mentioned talking about, laying a little bit down about what's going on in the Jewish tradition at this time. So on that Sunday, the Sunday before the Passover, Jesus, of course, is entering Jerusalem by one gate. And there is another gate. It's called Lamb's Gate. There's a gate where they are bringing in all of the lambs into the temple courtyard that are going to be observed over the next 2 to 3 days. They have to be observed by the temple officials, observed by the high priest. And then there will be a decision made about which one of those lambs is pure and perfect and without blemish to be sacrificed at the Passover. So I'm always really, I love to contemplate that Jesus is entering Jerusalem by one gate, and by another gate on that same day, Lamb Sunday, the lambs for the Passover sacrifice are also entering Jerusalem. So one of these is in fact a perfect lamb. So these lambs come into the temple, and where do they spend the next 2 or 3 days? The lambs are in the temple being observed by the high priest and being observed by temple officials to determine which one of them, and I'm talking about the little lambs, right? The little bye lambs, right? They're being observed to determine which of them is suitable for the sacrifice. That's sort of what Jesus is doing too. As the perfect lamb, he's entering Jerusalem by a different gate, but he's also going to be observed in the temple, right? It's where he spends some time over the next few days. So I love that illustration. And we think that night on Palm Sunday, Jesus and his disciples spent the night with, probably in Bethany, the town, of course, which was the home of it, just about 2 miles east of Jerusalem, actually. We tend to think of these places as being far apart, and they're not. But this is where Lazarus, whom Jesus had just raised from the dead, this is where Lazarus lives with his sisters, Mary and Martha, very close friends of Jesus. They probably hosted him and his apostles during their final days in Jerusalem. And I've always loved that part of the story too, that he spends his last days on earth with people that he really loved. These were very, very dear friends of his. So this entry, by the way, if you wanted to go and find this, the entry into Jerusalem, excuse me, see I haven't had coffee or anything. His entry into Jerusalem is recorded, of course, as we heard this morning. It's in Matthew's Gospel, it's in Mark's Gospel, Luke, and John. This is in all 4 Gospel stories. Okay, so on day two, this is, of course, the day that Jesus enters the temple and does something everybody loves to hear about, right? When he cleanses the temple, clears the temple. I think sometimes we get a little bit caught up in the drama of his righteous anger in the temple, and we forget something he does on the way to the temple. Y'all remember this story?
He turns over the tables.
Well, yes, he does when he gets to the temple. That's exactly right. But he returns with his disciples on day 2. Okay, he's going into Jerusalem. He's going to the temple. And remember, this is after the week before when they attempted to stone him, and he's had to flee, right, back to Bethany, and now he has returned to Jerusalem, knowing obviously what is waiting for him. So along the way along the way to the temple, he curses a fig tree. Why does he curse the fig tree?
Doesn't have any fruit.
It didn't bear any fruit. It had not borne any fruit. Some scholars kind of believe that this cursing of the fig tree represents God's judgment somehow on the spiritually dead religious leaders, on the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That this is sort of a metaphor for cursing this tree that had not borne fruit is actually him cursing the men he's getting ready to encounter again in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and the Sadducees that had borne no spiritual fruit. Others believe that the symbolism actually, y'all might not want to hear this, extends to all of us. It's all of us. That the Christian life demands that we bear fruit. It demands it of us. So genuine faith is more than just outward religiosity. It's more than, I think, as Father Rainey pointed out this morning, it's more than just doing what the church asks you to do. That's the minimum. You don't get a sticky star for that. But bearing fruit is something entirely different. True living faith has to be bearing spiritual fruit in a person's life and in a way that enhances the community too.
Fruit
So-
has the seeds in it.
Pardon me?
Fruit has seeds.
Fruit has seeds in it. That's right. That's right. So the fig tree, this fig tree, doesn't have self-awareness. It doesn't think it's being punished. You know, it's nothing like that. But I think Jesus makes it clear that there's a lesson here. Everything that he does is a teaching opportunity. Everything that he does that is recorded in the scriptures is intended for us to learn from. So this lesson applies to each one of us. Think about how this turns up again. This theme continues again later in the week. Okay, later in the week, at the Last Supper, where he says, I am the true vine. Every branch of mine that bears no fruit, he will take away. Speaking of God the Father, he will take away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it may bear more fruit. So we're hearing a lot about this in this week. As that branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. So clearly, spiritual fruitfulness, I should say, faithfulness and fruitfulness. But this is a big lesson. As he enters the temple, this is what he does. He curses a fig tree that has borne no fruit. Okay? So I think that's something for us to think about. So when Jesus arrives, I've seen so many different beautiful depictions of this. I actually wanted to show you a movie. The greatest scene in the Passion of the Christ, right, is this particular one where he's flipping the tables over. But when Jesus arrived at the temple, he finds the temple court, remember, is full of traders and money changers and people who have their tables set up for the local flea market inside the temple courts. And yes, he began flipping tables and making a whip out of cords and clearing the temple, saying, the scriptures declare, my temple will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. There's no doubt. Let's see. What day are we on? Oh my goodness, we're only on day 2. Right? We're only on day 2. So there's no doubt that this captures the attention of the temple leaders. It captures the attention of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priest, Caiaphas, no doubt, is aware of this by this point in time. You can't do something like this and go fly under the radar. But that was not the point, was it? That was not the point. Interestingly, let's go back and talk about kind of what's going on in the Jewish calendar. Interestingly, this is also the day that the lambs are going to begin to be observed in the temple. Okay? So there's a lot of activity in the temple area. Everyone's getting ready for the Passover. I mean, if you wanted to choose a day to do something where your actions would be the most visible, it would be this day. And let's not forget the parallel of the Lamb. He too is being observed, is he not? And he's being observed by who? The Pharisees, Sadducees, everyone. Okay? And I'm going to talk a little more about this in a minute. But there's something very specific that has to happen for the Jewish sacrifice, the sacrifice of the lamb to be valid. There's something very specific that has to happen. And in the oddest way, in the most dramatic way, Jesus is fulfilling that for himself, demonstrating he is the perfect lamb. Okay? This act that draws attention, that brings the attention of the high priest. So on Monday evening, it's Monday evening, I remember, day 2, Jesus stays in Bethany again, probably in the home of his friends, as I said, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Those events are also recorded in all 4 Gospels, if you wanted to go read all 4. Each one differs just a little bit. Mark gives us a little bit of a different timeline of events, but consistent in the events themselves. Okay? So on day 3, Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. On Tuesday morning, Jesus and his disciples returned to Jerusalem. They passed the withered fig tree along the way. That poor fig tree. They passed the withered fig tree along the way, and Jesus spoke to them, used it as an opportunity to speak to them about the importance of their faith. Again, an opportunity to do that. And back at the temple, the religious leaders how are they feeling? They happy to see him show up? The religious leaders are upset, obviously from the events of the day before, and he has established himself as a clear spiritual authority. He's done it in a very public sphere. He has done it at the holiest time of the Jewish year. Okay? And I think we have to really contemplate this as you go through this week. Remember on these specific days, some of which will pass us because I think that many of us are so focused on the Triduum, we forget that there is significance in all of this, all of these days of Holy Week. And so he has truly established himself as the spiritual authority in a way that has overturned the status quo. And to say countercultural does not quite say it. Does not quite say it. He's clearly something new. This is something different that he is doing. So we believe, and that most of the biblical scholars will agree on this, that this is kind of when the ambush idea begins. It's probably around the end of day 2, at the beginning of day 3. By Tuesday, you've got sort of a plot among the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, those religious leaders, how they're going to do this, how they're going to bring about the end of this man who's come in and upset things so much. But we get the sense that, Jesus, like the week before, he's evading them. He's coming in and very dramatically demonstrating his authority, and he is avoiding dealing or speaking with the religious leaders that he sees as hypocrites. But he does pronounce some kind of harsh judgment on this day. He says, quote, "Blind guides, for you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness." And then he calls them snakes. Sons of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of hell? Okay, that's directly out of Matthew's gospel. Snakes, sons of vipers. Okay, so what is he saying about them? When he calls them snakes, what's the allegorical reference we can immediately go to? Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the cursing of the serpent really going back to the Garden of Eden, right? And that's what he uses to refer to them, the religious leaders of Jerusalem. So, later that afternoon, he leaves the city and went with his disciples to the Mount of Olives. And again, we're still on day 3. which sits just due east of Jerusalem. And it actually overlooks Jerusalem. If you're on the Mount of Olives, you can see Jerusalem, the city below. And here he gives what's called the Olivet Discourse, or the Mount Olive Discourse, where this is the elaborate prophecy, right? That prophecy passage about the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of the age. He speaks, as usual, in parables. I'm going to ask one of you to remind me of something. Bobby Sue, can you remember at the end to say the word parable to me? Okay, thank you. But I have to do this with my students. I'm like, I will forget if I don't plan it with somebody. And if you forget, get somebody to help you. Okay. He speaks as usual in parables, and he uses very symbolic language, some of which, of course, is very difficult for us to understand if we just read it and not think about it. But he's speaking about the end of the age and his second coming. He's trying to tell them that I am bringing about a new Jerusalem. Remember, they're overlooking Jerusalem at this point. And again, he must be so frustrated at this point in time. I mean, how long have these people followed him and they still don't get it? Right? So he's saying they're overlooking Jerusalem, and he says to them, he's telling them about his second coming, his own second coming, and he's bringing about a new Jerusalem. And that's what the events of this week are all about, and the final judgment. He makes an allusion to the final judgment. So we also know, and this is, again, not something that all biblical scholars agree upon, because the timeline does not line up perfectly between all four Gospels, okay? So let's talk about that for just a second. Because a lot of times people will say, to me as a historian, well, isn't that problematic when you have four different accounts that disagree on specific dates and times of events? Isn't that problematic? And do y'all know what the answer from the historical perspective is? That you better expect that. If you have four different accounts of something, there needs to be a variation in it. Because if not, the historian is going to assume that everybody compared notes and made sure they wrote down the exact same thing, right? Giving more of an incredulity to an account than giving it legitimacy. So, for instance, if I were talking about completely secular documents, some completely, a state document, state papers, letters, whatever, if you have four people who are describing the same events, there is going to be a natural variation. And the historian is trying to look for that. Okay? So no, to me, this tells me that they're all recording what their individual memory of it was. Remember that Matthew is an eyewitness up to this point. Now, he's not going to be on Good Friday. We only got one really good eyewitness on Good Friday, right? Matthew's an eyewitness. Mark is not. Mark's gospel represents Peter's narrative, we think. So Mark is kind of getting his accounts probably from Peter's notes, or Peter's oral testimony to him. Luke is not a contemporary of Jesus. Luke's a companion of St. Paul's. So he is writing, again, kind of a secondary kind of history. John's an eyewitness. John hangs with Jesus the whole week. So I think that when you put these accounts together, you begin to see this consensus develop if you understand their relationships to each other and their relationships to Jesus, if that makes any sense. So Scripture indicates, for the most part, that Tuesday is also the day that Judas first made contact with the Sanhedrin. Maybe he's just making an inquiry at this point in time, but we believe that this is the day that he first meets with them to plan to betray Jesus. He's thinking about it on this day. And after this long day that we have of confrontations warnings about the future. Again, Jesus and his apostles returned to Bethany that night to stay the night in the home of his very good friends. Let's don't miss that this week. He has people who love him right up until the end. Really, really do. The tumultuous events of Tuesday and the Olivet Discourse are recorded in, again, all four Gospels record that, with just a little bit of variation, especially in Mark. Okay, then we get to day 4, which is on some calendars, this is referred to as Holy Wednesday. It's been a Catholic tradition for a very long time to call it Spy Wednesday, right? Because it makes us sound cool, I think. Spy Wednesday. It's not though. The Spy Wednesday. This is a day in which the scriptures don't really tell us specifically what Jesus is doing on Wednesday. The record is silent. Scholars speculate that after spending 2 pretty exhausting days, that Jesus may have spent this day in Bethany, knowing that he was going to re-enter Jerusalem for the Passover. That he may have spent his last day as a free man, right? His last day on earth with friends, that he chose to stay in Bethany. He had already revealed to everyone to his apostles anyway, he'd already revealed what was going to happen. I don't think they got it yet. He revealed why it was going to happen. He had already revealed the week before that he had power over death by calling Lazarus out of the grave. I mean, imagine what the mindset of the apostles must be at this point in midweek. After seeing that incredible miracle of the week before, you know that most of the people of Bethany and that area, they all knew he had done this. They had to have believed that he was the Son of God. No doubt brought more people to him in those last few days. So, but this is the day, Spy Wednesday is the day, as you see here, that Judas receives the money, we think. Spy Wednesday. This is when he meets with the Sanhedrin and agrees that he will deliver them to Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Okay, so we call this Spy Wednesday. And remember when I did the talk about looking at Lenten practices across the ages? Do you remember this? We talked about eating beaver tail.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is among medieval Christians, Wednesday was always a day of fast. Because of the events of Wednesday. This is Spy Wednesday. It's the day Judas betrayed Jesus. Now let's get this straight. So he meets with them on Tuesday. He receives the money, we believe, on Wednesday. The actual betrayal does not take place until the garden on Thursday, right? But this is a series of events leading up to Judas's ultimate betrayal of Christ. So also in Bethany, this is just a few nights earlier. This is in the previous week, but I think it's important to go back and talk about it. And again, we heard this morning. Lazarus' sister Mary had very lovingly anointed Jesus in preparation for his burial. A very expensive perfume. Do you remember that reading? And in Matthew 26, we're told that it's a pint of pure nard. Okay, pint. Y'all, that's a lot. It's a lot. And I've heard it, and I cannot remember the source. Now that I'm going to say this, I wish I could remember the source. But I've heard it said that this is enough to anoint 12 kings for burial. And Mary very lovingly does this. There's a couple of different accounts. The account we heard this morning was that she poured it on his head, right? And I believe it is John's gospel that tells us that she anointed his feet and wiped his feet with her hair. Sometimes that story gets conflated with with the story of Mary Magdalene. It is Mary of Bethany who anointed him. Okay, it is Mary of Bethany. Now, clearly, Mary Magdalene has a role to play in the anointing after, but okay. So, and I love this. This is more of a obviously modern, more abstract painting, but I really love the colors in that, and captures, I think, that beautiful expression on her face, humble expression. Okay, so everybody knows that painting. So this is day 5. We're up to day 5. So Holy Week takes this this intended last turn on Thursday. From Bethany, Jesus sent Peter and John ahead to the upper room where he was going to have the Passover meal to make preparations for the feast. And that evening, after sunset, he washed the feet of his disciples as they prepared to share in the Passover. So again, I would encourage you to contemplate that this week, and especially to our catechumens and our candidates, to come to the Holy Thursday Mass is beautiful. To see that ritual of the washing of the feet, this is ancient. Goes right back to the Last Supper, and it is a humble act of service that he demonstrates by example how we are to love one another. Okay, so the message of this night is to love one another, and he demonstrates that by washing the feet of his apostles. So we practice foot washing as part of the liturgy on that night. Okay, it's a beautiful thing to see. Then Jesus shares in the feast of the Passover with his disciples and institutes the Eucharist at that Last Supper. And he tells them, essentially, I have looked forward to eating this Passover meal. He tells them that. I've looked forward to this. Some translations are, I have been eager. I have been anxious. I am ready to celebrate this Passover with you before my suffering begins. For I tell you now that I won't eat this again until its meaning is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. So we see that mirrored again when he talks about not drinking the last cup until he is in the kingdom. Again, there is Jewish symbolism here. The Passover sacrifice is not complete until that last cup has been consumed. Okay? And Jesus refuses that last cup. Why? Because the sacrifice is not complete. So remember that as the lamb, as the Passover sacrifice himself, he is applying and ascribing to himself and his journey through this week everything that the Passover lambs are going through. Yeah? So he's giving his own body to be sacrificed like the lambs in the temple. One of them is going to be chosen for that sacrifice. And during this, he is, of course, obviously when he institutes the Eucharist. So later, that's, of course, Da Vinci's famous depiction of that. And we've talked about that. Everybody knows which one is Judas, right? If you look across, you can always pick him out, because if you look across horizontally, he's the one at the lowest point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I love that Da Vinci did that. And then, of course, they leave the upper room and they go to the, yes, Deacon.
Just go back to the last slide. You said something that I'm kind of saying it for the OCIA.
Yes.
But if you're at the Holy Thursday Mass, Cheryl just said he doesn't drink that last cup. We do not in the Mass. We take the host and process it
Yes.
to the chapel. But the Mass is never really...
It's never concluded.
It's never concluded. We actually start the Holy Saturday Vigil without the normal opening of the Mass. It's like we're going back to that celebration, that Holy Thursday Mass, and we're continuing it to the ending. So I just love that symbolism that kind of goes.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because it's exactly right. Not drinking the last cup, there is no conclusion until the sacrifice is complete. Yeah, it's beautiful. In our liturgy, even.
Which means that we live in a spirit of prayer, devotion throughout the 3 holy days.
Right, throughout the Triduum.
We're still in the mess.
Right. Still in the mass.
Show us which one is, good point, because I still, okay.
That's the door, right here. And you can't see this, the detail, but he's holding a bag. That's also a giveaway. It's also a money bag, he's holding a bag, yeah. So I'd have to get my cheat sheets to tell you all of them are. I know that this is Simon the Zealot on the end here. And this is John, obviously, here, Peter right here, and that's Judas. But they're grouped in threes. If you ever noticed that, they're grouped in threes. It's kind of Da Vinci's, I think Da Vinci's attempt at both harmony and the idea of threes representing harmony. That's a kind of a classical principle, but it's also, of course, Trinitarian. There's 12 of them, so we group them in threes. I'm always so struck by this because Jesus is the only one in the painting who is not bothered. Everybody's got some drama going on except him.
So the question is it I? Is it I?
This is the moment. This is the moment when Jesus dropped the bomb. This is the moment when he says, oh, by the way, one of you is going to betray me. And like, he's looking down like, I know who it is. But it's exactly what's going on. The apostles are reacting to that.
In artistic terms, there's a vanishing point.
Yes.
All the lines are vanishing to a point, and that is Christ himself.
It's actually, it is Christ, but only for a second. It's interesting that if you look at this, if you look at it and then look down and look again, your eye is drawn to Christ, but it's also kind of over his right shoulder to the landscape behind him, which probably for Da Vinci represents eternity. It's a vanishing landscape, see behind him. Again, a classical principle that he reintroduces. So, now y'all should not get me started on art. Because we could talk about this the rest of the time. But anyway, yeah, it is a beautiful, and obviously the most famous Last Supper. It's not the only Last Supper, but it is clearly the most famous one, most recognizable one. So they leave here and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where, to me, this is a really hard part for me to hear about and to contemplate. That Jesus in his humanity, and remember, he is human. Yes, he's fully divine, but he's also fully human. He knew what he was getting ready to suffer. And he doesn't want to. As a human being, he does not want to suffer this. And he's going to suffer physical pain just like you or I would. He's going to suffer a physical death just like you or I would. But it is not going to be an easy death. It is not going to be a quick death. So he prays in agony to God the Father. Luke's gospel tells us that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground, telling us that he's in a state of extreme physiological stress, that the capillaries beneath the skin have broken, and that blood is actually coming through his sweat glands. There's a medical explanation for it, but it's pretty dramatic. So later that evening, of course, is when Jesus is betrayed. This is Caravaggio's The Taking of Christ, that I actually have a print of. The Taking of Christ by Caravaggio. Betrayed with a kiss and arrested by the Sanhedrin. So he's taken to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the whole council, of course, the whole Sanhedrin has gathered to begin making their case against Jesus. They've been working on since Monday, right, when he's flipping tables in the temple. They've been working on this. So meanwhile, in the early morning hours, as Jesus' trial is getting underway, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, right? 3 times. Denies knowing him. And again, these events are all recorded in all 4 Gospels. Okay. So So now on day 6, we all know what happens here. This is actually a painting I really love called Quid Est Veritas by Nikolai Gay. He's a Russian artist. This is the moment where Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? You know? And what's interesting about this is that Jesus is in shadow. Pilate is in light. Don't you find that interesting? Why might the artist have used this convention? Think about it. This is the moment where Jesus says who he is. I seek truth. I come to seek truth. And Pilate says, what is truth? Quid est veritas. What is truth?
He can't see it. He can't see the truth standing in front of him.
He can't see the truth standing in front of him. Jesus is obscured in shadow to Pilate. Right? But Pilate is in the light because he's seeking. So I've always loved the dichotomy of that Pilate to me was a seeker. You know, there's an early Christian tradition that Pilate left. We don't really know. The history books are silent about what happened to him. Do you know that? He just kind of disappears off the pages of history. And there's an early Christian tradition that he became a Christian. You know, it is a tradition with a little t. Okay? I'll be very clear about that. We're not talking about sacred tradition. It's tradition with a little t that he became a Christian. Because he disappears kind of off of the pages of history after this.
He tried to release Jesus.
Yes, wanted to release Jesus, wanted to spare his life, tried to spare his life. So Good Friday for us is the most difficult day, I think, of the Passion Week. I mean, it should be that way. Very, very painful, these last final hours on earth, of his human existence on earth. According to sacred scripture, this is the day that Judas was overcome with remorse and hanged himself, or took his own life, which raises all sorts of questions. I know we've talked about it here before. What about Judas? Yeah, that's a whole thing we could talk about another time, or if we have time, I'm happy to talk about it today. But meanwhile, before the third hour, which is 9 a.m., Jesus has already endured all sorts of false accusations, mockery, beatings. His apostles have abandoned him, except for John. They've all fled. One of the things that was my Lenten, and I'm just going to show this kind of on a personal level, one of the things that has been my Lenten contemplation, that whenever we read the Passion narrative, there's 4 words that I read through and I have always overlooked, that I've never really stopped to think about, because when you get caught up in all the bloody business of Good Friday, it's easy to overlook 4 words. They spat on him. That doesn't sound like much, does it? When you think about the events of that day. But for some reason, this Lent, as I was reading, I always begin Lent by reading the Passion narrative. That's how I begin it. And for some reason, those 4 words jumped off of the page at me. They spat on him. And I thought, oh my heavens, Lord, really? All the things they did to you that day, and this is what you want me to think about? They spat on him. But think about all of the mockery and the contempt that is in that simple act. No matter what they did to him physically, I mean, that was an act of pure contempt for who he was and what he came to do. And so that's been a kind of an interesting contemplation for me. You'd be surprised how many of the medieval mystics wrote about that too. So that's been kind of fun to look at. Well, not fun, in an entertaining way. It's been beneficial, I should say, not fun. It's been beneficial. So he's sentenced to death by crucifixion, which is obviously the worst, reserved for the worst criminals. Yes.
Could I say, the thing that jumped off out of the Passion narrative to me this year was after they crowned him with thorns, they beat him on the head. Now, it's not simply a beating on the head, it's beating those thorns into his head.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I've read one said that one of the thorns blinded Jesus. Is that probable?
Well, certainly he had blood running in his eyes. I mean, there is, if you look at the wounds on the head of the man on the Shroud of Turin, there's a huge wound, a gash in the forehead that extends into the eye area. So, I mean, it's certainly possible, and that's an excellent point, by the way, of beating him on the head, pushing those thorns further into his skull. Now this is something that I know that Father Peter had done a meditation for the Museum of the Bible a few years ago on Good Friday, it was a Good Friday meditation. It wasn't on Good Friday, but talking about the meaning of the wounds and the crowning with thorns was something I thought was really beautiful. But if you consider that when man and woman were exiled from Eden, God immediately cursed the ground and said that thorns and thistles it shall grow for you. And yet when Jesus, the day that Jesus is crucified and is actually in this redemptive act for all of humanity, he chooses. Now remember, he's writing this narrative. Don't forget, don't lose sight of that, right? He's writing the story. He's the author of it. And he chooses to take upon his head, therefore, the very symbol of man's disobedience when he was exiled from Eden. He took that on his head and wore it to the cross. So I really thought that was a beautiful illustration about that too. But yeah, there's so much in that passion narrative on the way to Calvary. So witnessing these events on Good Friday, witnessing all of the events, was no doubt Caiaphas, the high priest. Under Jewish law, the Passover lamb to be sacrificed, that Passover was not valid if it was not observed by the high priest. So the Passover lamb, the perfect lamb, Jesus, his sacrifice is valid under Jewish law, which I think is an interesting point of congruence for us. So, at some point, I think it's always good. I mean, at some point, I'd like to come back and do this to talk about Jesus' final words on the cross. We know that he had 7 final statements that he spoke from the cross. And then, of course, it was finished. So, I wanted to show you this. I debated about this. This, of course, is the scourging. And this is a scene. This is actually a screen capture from the Passion of the Christ. Do y'all recognize that scene? Isn't it horrific? Everything you see depicted in art of the scourging of Jesus is almost bloodless. He's tied to a pillar, and there's somebody standing there. He might have 1 or 2 bumps or bruises on him. But guys, this is what it was like. This is it. And I think we need to see that. I really think we need to see this. So I didn't choose an artwork. I did a screen capture of this particular scene in the Passion of the Christ. This is after, of course, the scourging is over. Okay. So by 6 p.m. Friday evening, this is a famous depiction of the crucifixion. I like it because it's somewhat forensically accurate, not perfect, but somewhat. Then we have Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, the Apostle John, we believe, taking Jesus' body down from the cross, laying it in the tomb. And all of these events are recorded again in all 4 Gospels. Most of the detail is in John's Gospel, which I think is you would expect. As a historian, I would expect that because John's the eyewitness. He's the one who really sees all of it and was probably, no doubt, part of the party that brought his body down from the cross. So the body lays in the tomb where it is guarded by soldiers. Y'all remember that detail because Rome was worried somebody was going to take his body. So it's guarded by soldiers. And then what happens next? Oh, I'm gonna talk about that in just a second. I'm gonna talk about that, but I wanna see if I got something about, day 7, which is silence, Holy Saturday. And thank you both, Deacon and Father, for making that point about Holy Thursday. The night of Holy Thursday into Easter Vigil. I think that's beautiful. This is a time of silence. But Jesus was not resting. What does the Apostles' Creed tell us he did? He descended to the dead. Right, he descended to the dead. And so that is part of our early tradition. He experienced physical human death just like we do. He had his body remaining in the grave, but his soul remains in the place of the righteous dead, as the Jews would have called it, Abraham's bosom, where the righteous dead were, who had gone before, and he descended to them. This is traditionally, we ascribe that on the Christian calendar to this Holy Saturday, the time the world is waiting in silence, the world is waiting in darkness, but he is actively at work among the dead.
He is offering salvation.
Offering
to the
salvation
faithful.
to Abraham's bosom.
There you go.
Yeah.
So, what about all those people who lived before Jesus? You know, do they have any hope of salvation? Well, this, which is part of the tradition and scripture,
Right.
that he is preaching salvation, offering salvation, so they too have an opportunity to come to salvation through Christ.
Right. So is there, and I've heard a little bit different interpretation of this, Father, so you help me out here. Is there, we're not saying that he descended to the hell of the damned, right? But to the realm of the righteous dead. Those people who had died before, righteous people who had died before, yeah. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, and I may have even, let me see if I even made a note of this. Well, I can tell you the paragraph. I apparently was intended to go back and look at it. It's the Catechism, paragraph 633, that talks about, it's precisely for these holy souls that Jesus descended to the dead on this particular day. Okay, and then we all know what happens on Sunday. Yes, what a glorious scene on Sunday. Okay, so I want to tell you guys something that, I mean, I don't think